A Falcons player getting arrested in Miami before the Super Bowl? Well, I didn't think we'd get here again.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The winter games are on, and there's no better way to follow them than with a bet on FanDuel. FanDuel, play your game. Now, if you don't know me, I am your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 20 years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And today on your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we are talking all about the arrest of James Pearce, the charges against him, sort of our interpretation of the timeline, what the NFL is going to do, what the Falcons are going to do next. Are they going to wait and see? Are they going to cut him? Whatever. And we'll also talk about, should the Falcons have seen this coming from a mile away? But for those of you that missed it, James Pearce was arrested on Saturday after an alleged domestic dispute with WNBA player Rickea Jackson, his ex-girlfriend. And before we get into all of this, I want to give the disclaimer that I am just a guy that talks about football on the internet. I am not a legal expert. I'm going to do to the best of my ability to cover it in a way, but I welcome any feedback from at least other people that are closer to legal expertise, not just other random people that talk about football on the internet in the comments and whatnot, but lawyers, cops, all those various things in the comments below here on YouTube. Hit me up via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. Insiders, I had a conversation with one former cop here in Georgia that is an insider to give me a little bit of background on it. So I would appreciate all the feedback on that front. But I'm going to do my best to kind of piece this together from my very limited understanding of this. But there are 5 charges against James Pearce Jr., 2 counts of aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, 1 aggravated stalking, 1 fleeing the police, and 1 resisting arrest. And my understanding of this timeline is on Thursday. We know that James Pearce was in San Francisco as one of the finalists for Defensive Rookie of the Year at NFL Honors. I noticed that Rickea Jackson was not with him and was like, oh, that's interesting. And then on Friday, Rickea Jackson was in Miami for Unrivaled, which I believe is the 3-on-3 offseason league that the WNBA players participate in. And I've heard various rumors on social media that I cannot confirm that James Pearce was at that game. But this is where kind of the aggravated stalking comes in, because it stems from my understanding that he was violating a restraining order that Jackson had against him. So that's the first charge, by being in Miami at the game. And then this ultimate incident on Saturday where Pearce confronted Jackson allegedly at an intersection when she was in her car. He was also in his own car, which is, I believe, a Lamborghini reported to be. She fled. He pursued. Allegedly, his car made contact, struck her car multiple times in that pursuit. And that, to me, is my understanding of the first count of aggravated battery with the deadly weapon, with the car, I believe, being the deadly weapon. But we'll see if further details come out about that. And she was making her way to the police station, and due to the stalking his violence against her, he's trying to stop her from doing so. The police arrive on the scene. He flees. This is the fleeing the police charge, and in so doing struck a police officer with his car in the leg, which I believe is what the second count of aggravated battery against the officer was. He's pursued, he's captured, and dogpiled by a bunch of cops when he was apprehended. There's video of that floating around on social media, and that's the resisting arrest charge. And obviously we'll get more details as they emerge or things change, but that's my understanding of what went down on Saturday. So what's going to happen now? This legal situation is going to have to play itself out for James Pearce, and that could take months, that could take years. We might not see a resolution to this until the calendar year of 2027, and that resolution could include charges being dropped, could include pleas being made, and it also very much could include him serving serious jail time. Now, I'm not as sort of expecting that at this point in time, but we'll see how things develop. And it's not because of anything that James Pearce did or did not do in this specific incident. Again, I'm not a legal expert, but we know in the U.S. legal system, and maybe this is too cynical of me to say, but the more money you have, the less likely it is that you're going to go to prison. And JPJ has plenty of money, although one of the potential fallouts of this incident is the Falcons potentially voiding the guarantees in his current contract. But as we learn more information on that front, we'll talk about it, but we're not going to talk about that today. The immediate reaction, I think, has been overwhelmingly that James Pearce Jr.'s NFL and Falcon career are over. Again, I'm not as convinced that's true. I think it's maybe over, but at least for me, it's a little too early to tell, just because the NFL and the Falcons aren't really obligated to punish him until the legal situation plays out. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And I say that, not because I think that's how this should go down, but I think that's how it's most likely to go down, how it will go down, right? One of the things that we often talk about on this podcast is reality versus fantasy, right? And that usually, manifests itself in, me having more quote unquote realistic, grounded expectations, particularly when it comes to how the Falcons perform on the field, while many of you have much more, we'll call them fantastic, pie in the sky, hopeful expectations for how the Falcons perform on the field. But today we're talking about how this manifests, in terms of a specific Falcon player off the field. And so it's not to say that James Pearce should come back to Atlanta, but it's just we're kind of talking more realistically about what will or what could happen for him. And you guys know I'm naturally skeptical of things, and I'm skeptical that James Pearce is guilty of these charges, right? I think he probably did this, but I have to say probably because it's all accusations, innocent until proved guilty, all that sort of stuff. So it's all alleged at this point in time. But as we wait for him to have his actual day in court, where all the truth seemingly will come out, the court of public opinion is going to do the bulk of the heavy lifting until then, right? And that could prompt the Falcons to move on. And I think there are two things that could push the Falcons in that direction. One, Rickea Jackson is famous. And it doesn't mean that domestic violence against quote unquote regular women is less heinous, or regular men for that matter, because men also suffer from domestic violence. But let's be honest, the public outcry against James Pearce is going to be a lot louder for someone like Rickea Jackson, who has 500,000 followers on Instagram, than it would be if someone had 50 followers on Instagram. The second thing is video. As we saw 12 years ago with Ray Rice, who was, involved in a domestic violence dispute with his fiance at the time. He was initially suspended, and then video dropped of the actual violence that he committed against his fiance. And then he was essentially, it resulted in him being banned from the NFL. Once it is basically, if you can see what James Pearce did on your phone, as opposed to having to imagine it in your head, and you can actually see it, that's going to lead to a much louder public outcry that could prompt the Falcons to move on from James Pearce. So I say that if video surfaces of James Pearce Jr. trying to run Rickea Jackson off the road, or purposefully running over a cop or whatever, that's going to amplify the public outcry, and that could lead to James Pearce Jr. Dismissal. But other than those things happening, my suspicion is that this situation may, and again, I emphasize may, don't know, we're still within the first, 16 hours or whatever since this incident happened, or 20 hours, I think, as I'm sitting here recording this, is probably going to play out more like the Rashee Rice situation in Kansas City a couple of years ago, where he was involved in a hit and run incident in the spring of 2024, had a host of charges. He played in 2024. He only played 4 games due to an injury. But he sort of had that legal situation hanging on his head for the next year plus, I think the next 14 months. Eventually it got, resolved in the summer of 2025. Some of the charges were dropped. He pled to lesser charges, and he wound up being suspended 6 games at the start of the 2025 season by the NFL. And, Rashee Rice, whether we talk about him or other players, and this includes James Pearce Jr., as we know, the leash on good football players for bad behavior off the football field is much longer. And Pearce definitely fits into this category because he's a first-round pick who just had 10.5 sacks, the most sacks that any Falcons player has had in a decade. And so he's going to get a longer leash than other players, whether that's fair or not. And so I wouldn't be shocked at all if this plays out like the Rashee Rice situation, where James Pearce Jr. plays football for the Atlanta Falcons in 2026. as this legal situation hangs over his head for the rest of the calendar year, and then eventually potentially gets resolved next year. And that's when he serves his suspension, and and then he continues to play football for the Atlanta Falcons. Now, we'll see if that's how it plays out. Again, I am not a legal expert, which is why I say that's maybe how that plays out. But when we talk about James Pearce's future in Atlanta in the NFL, but when it comes to these conversations, most NFL teams play the wait and see game. And the question is going to be whether or not the Atlanta Falcons will follow suit and play the game that other NFL teams typically play. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the winter games are officially here. And if you're anything like us, you're locking in for events that you only get to see on the biggest stage every 4 years. And that's why following the winter games on FanDuel is the thing that makes the most sense. From medal counts to individual events to finding your angle on sports that you care about most, FanDuel is going to give you more ways to stay connected to the action. It's the Olympics, so the drama, the intensity is there. Whether you're an expert on sports like curling or speed skating or hockey, or you're like me and you're just like, I don't know the first thing about half of these sports that are played over in Milan. But we know that even niche events become must-watch when you're fully locked into the competition, and you can stay locked into the competition, whether it's rooting for your home country or loving that underdog story by heading over to FanDuel, which is going to keep the entire Olympic experience engaging from start to finish. So the winter games are on, and there's no better way to follow them than with FanDuel. FanDuel, play your game. So before we continue today's Locked On Falcons, want to plug the Everydayer Club. We thank each and every one of you that makes Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. You are the reason why Locked On is the #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy, and you can level up your everydayerness by joining the Everydayer Club, where you get a lot of sweet perks, ad-free version of the podcast, access to Locked On Podcast Network Discord, and a link to a merch store where you can get sweet merch like this red Locked On Falcons hoodie that I'm wearing on YouTube and whatnot. So go check it out at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. It's only $5 a month, $50 a year. So there's no real incentive for the Falcons to immediately punish James Pearce until the legal process plays out, other than the obvious, when it comes to public perception of the Atlanta Falcons organization that chooses not to punish, if they so choose to do that, James Pearce. But my understanding of these incidents is that these are kind of the unique purview of NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell. It's just kind of easier for NFL teams to say, like, we'll just let the league office handle these sort of situations and we'll figure it out later. And so we'll see if the Falcons decide to move off of James Pearce. We know that the Falcons ownership and Arthur Blank prides himself on having a team that is community focused, someone that the community in the city of Atlanta can be proud of. This has been a huge point of emphasis for the Atlanta Falcons since the Michael Vick conviction from dogfighting back in 2007. But I bring this up because, Arthur Blank doesn't always follow through on that vision. And we saw this almost 4 years ago, with the team's pursuit of Deshaun Watson. And I know in the year since, Blank has denied or minimized the Falcons' seriousness in terms of their pursuit of Deshaun Watson, but it's not a secret among local as well as national media people that, Blank was driving that pursuit. And basically in that situation back in March of 2022, once Deshaun Watson, my recollection, again, it's been a while, I haven't spent that much time thinking about it. But once Deshaun Watson was not indicted on the 20 plus, charges of sexual misconduct that he had at the time, we saw a lot of NFL teams pouncing. It was basically once NFL teams like, oh, he's not going to jail, so he's going to be available to play football. Okay, well, let's go get him. And they were willing to overlook those 20 plus charges because at the time he was perceived to be one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. And that kind of underlines my previous point about the leash being longer for good football players when it comes to their off-field behavior. And I bring that up because that incident potentially complicates how we perceive the potential of the Atlanta Falcons organizational follow-through, that their vision in terms of we're the good guys doesn't always mesh with reality. As we often say, actions speak louder than words, and the Falcons' actions at times don't always, they do often, but don't always reflect their words when it comes to how they like to be perceived. Now, to Blank's credit, like I said, that was one incident in basically the 20 plus years that he's owned the Atlanta Falcons. And so most of the time, the Falcons' actions do reflect their words, right? But, I've been a daily podcaster for 10 years on this podcast, and I could probably count on one hand how many times I've had to talk about the Falcons, player getting arrested in that time. And we've done close to probably 3,000 episodes in that time. So again, that's a nice precedent overall. And several of those times where I do recall talking about that, Barkevius Mingo, Prince Shimbo immediately leaped to mind. Those players were cut immediately given their incidents. But I think in both players' cases, their charges were eventually dropped. But neither guy was good enough for the Falcons to sit there and weather the storm. And basically what I'm sitting here saying is James Pearce is good enough that the Falcons could potentially decide to weather the storm from the public outcry that is going to be, you have to cut this man, right? And there should be a public outcry, right? I'm not going to sit here and get on a moral, ethical soapbox or anything, not because I'm, pro domestic violence or anything, but I do think back to those 5 days when the Falcons were pursuing Deshaun Watson and the cognitive dissonance I was going through, where the Falcons at that time were the leaders to land Deshaun Watson, and my belief that he was a sexual predator, but also he could be the starting quarterback of the Atlanta Falcons. And how do I resolve those two things? And by becoming the Falcons starting quarterback, potentially could help the Falcons win a lot of games. And that is something that I also would like to see the Falcons do, winning a lot of football games. And the conversation around James Pearce is going to be similar. He's probably a bad guy, right? Probably. Again, I have to say probably. Allegedly a bad guy, right? But he also can help them win a lot of football games. And I could sit here and say the Falcons must take a stand on accountability and say it and believe it to a certain extent and cut James Pearce. But I'm also aware that there's probably 31 other NFL teams that wouldn't do that because of what we said, where it's just like, oh, well, he's good enough. Well, let's just wait and see. Let's wait and see if the charges get dropped. Let's wait and see if he's only going to be suspended for 6 games or 8 games or whatever. And again, that's a failing on my part, I think, because I probably care more about the Falcons winning games than I care about the Falcons being potentially the one team that practices what they preach and, their actions live up to the words about when it comes to accountability. And I'm still processing that character flaw for me personally. And their failed pursuit of Watson meant that I didn't really have to reconcile those feelings, right? It's like, oh, okay, well, I don't have to worry about that back in March of 2022. But I guess I can't really put that off anymore. And so I'm going to have to reconcile that with James Pearce. And hopefully it's not going to take me 5 days to come to my senses. But that's kind of where I'm at right now. So at some point, I may be sitting here going like, yeah, the Falcons have to cut James Pearce. I'm not quite ready to declare that right now, not because of some moral obligation or anything like that, but just again, because that's not usually how it works in the NFL. So that's kind of where I think on that, but we'll see. I welcome all your feedback on that front, on my character flaws, as well as what you think the Falcons should do. But, the last question we'll ask is, should the Falcons have seen this coming? And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, we know the Falcons' history of hiring coaches may not be that illustrious because they often find someone who looks good on paper but isn't quite the right fit, but only if the NFL teams had Indeed sponsored job, today's sponsor, to help them find the right match. Now, if you're hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other websites. Indeed sponsored jobs is going to put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. So spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed sponsored jobs. Get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, do it the right way with Indeed. So in a nutshell, this is why you don't draft players with character issues, right? So, and it's not because you knew this specific incident was going to happen, but it's the likelihood of some type of incident is going to happen. And as we discussed a lot last year, and as I'm sure many of you recognize, Pierce had several character red flags coming out of the University of Tennessee. But Raheem Morris, the former Falcons head coach, Terry Fontenot, the former Falcons general manager, vouched for him. And we talked about it at the time, where the fact that those two individuals were very upfront with all the quote unquote homework that they had done on James Pearce, indicated that there was smoke, there was fire, right? There was smoke. Where there's smoke, there's fire, right? But essentially they were like, we looked him in the eye, we looked his mother in the eye, and we believe that James Pearce is not a bad guy, and we're willing to, stake our job, stake our reputation on him. And they were willing to give up a future first round pick in order to do so. The only real off-field incident that he suffered in college was, I believe, a speeding ticket. And, when we talk about character concerns, it was one of the things that we talked about last year, where the perception, this character stuff is overblown because he didn't get arrested. But it was really less character issues, because a lot of that is focused on, were you arrested for doing bad stuff, versus maturity issues, which is much more nebulous and much more fitting in personality based. And we talked about this a ton last May, when we talked about how his coaching staff kind of threw him under the bus. We talked about some of the anonymous scout quotes that called a lot of his maturity things into question. And we talked about just watching the film and watching his demeanor on the field, right? Where he didn't look like a team guy, right? He'd make a play, he'd celebrate. When his teammates made a play, he'd just walk back to the huddle. And the way that we kind of phrased it is like, James Pearce, from a personality standpoint, from a playing, demeanor standpoint, is more of a cat than a dog, right? And when we talk about cats and dogs, and this is not universally true, but the general trend, right? Dogs tend to be very affable, social, kind of a good hang, right? Good in groups, perfect team member. Cats tend to be all the opposite things, much more solitary. And I remember some of the comments I got on that video when we talked about it was, hey, a tiger is a cat, or a lion is a cat. I can't remember the specific cat that they use, but let's say tiger. And yeah, you're absolutely right. And when a tiger is hunting deer in the jungles of India, you got no problem with a tiger being a tiger. But if you decide to try to tame that tiger and make it a pet and bring it into your house, you're going to have some problems with a tiger being a tiger. And that's kind of a perfect summary of this situation with James Pearce and the character issues, right? You brought the tiger inside the house and you got mauled. And this is, to me, part of the reason why you never heard me over the last 9 months on this podcast fully embrace, the idea of James Pearce and he's our guy and we won the trade and all the rah stuff that you saw elsewhere. Because in the back of my mind, there was always a risk that tiger is going to tiger, right? And so, yes, the Falcons should have absolutely seen this coming, And even when he was racking up 10 sacks in the final 9 games, and we were all like, oh, I say we, not meaning you. Not me, but everybody was declaring that the Falcons had won the trade, and I was like, let's wait and see. Let's see how this plays out, right? Not because, again, knew this specific incident was on the horizon, but there was always the possibility, given tiger-like tendencies, that this wouldn't age well. It's like, oh, the tiger's fine right now, but it's still a tiger. And I remember having a conversation with Jarvis Davis last spring. I think that conversation was about Mike Green, not James Pearce. But I remember specifically talking to Jarvis about when the Falcons make character risk bets, it almost always, if not always, ends poorly for them. And I contrasted that to when, Andy Reid-led teams in Philadelphia and Kansas City have made similar character risk bets. It tends to work out. And just off the top of my head, a couple of examples of guys that fell in the draft because they had quote unquote character concerns, red flags and whatnot. Deshaun Jackson, Travis Kelce, Tyreek Hill, Kareem Hunt, right? And I remember telling Jarvis that, if Andy Reid was leading the Falcons and they were betting on a player like, we were talking about, I think, Mike Green, but same applies to James Pearce, Andy Reid over 25 years has earned the benefit of the doubt when it comes to those bets. The Falcons have earned anything but that. And we can sit here and say, again, now clearly with the power of hindsight, of course, they should have seen this coming. But, the key with whether we're talking about the Andy Reid-led teams or other NFL teams, the key when it comes to betting on these, character risk guys is you got to mitigate risk. The Ravens did that when they drafted Mike Green in the second round, even though we spent all of the spring expecting Mike Green to be an early first-round pick. Other teams do that, right? Deshaun Jackson was a second-round pick. Kareem Hunt and Travis Kelce, I believe, are third-round picks. Tyreek Hill was a fifth-round pick, right? The point is to lower your risk so that if or when that player acts up, when that tigers, right, you have less financial incentives, right? It's not going to burn you as bad, right? It's going to be far less of a bad look if you have to cut a fifth-round pick because he's out here tigering than it is cutting a first-round pick. But the Falcons, in their infinite wisdom, thanks to Raheem and Terry, decided they were going to maximize their risk because they decided to trade up for James Pearce. That rather than mitigating the risk, they were maximizing it. And we could wax poetic about all the steps that led to that and, them feeling pressure to win now and needing to fix the pass rush because they, ignored that problem for multiple years and all that stuff. We're not going to get into that on today's episode. But certainly when we talk about the new regime, who's not going to have the same loyalty to James Pearce that the old regime had because they didn't draft him. They weren't willing to maximize the risk. Hopefully we will not find ourselves in such situations where we're willing to overlook the fact that that's a tiger and it might maul us, and it probably will maul us at some point just simply because, well, we need a tiger. So those are my thoughts on that. In the end, all that really matters in this situation is that Rickea Jackson is safe and continues to be so. This will be a developing story. I'm sure there's a possibility 24 hours from now, we'll be sitting here on the podcast being like, well, that escalated a lot quicker than we thought. So we'll see how this continues to develop. I'm sure, as long as James Pearce is on the Falcons roster, which he is as I'm sitting here recording this podcast, this will be a continued topic of conversation we'll continue to speculate about. But as I said earlier, I think his time in Atlanta, is it over? Maybe. We'll see what decisions the Falcons make. But our next episode should be a short Super Bowl recap, right? Where I'll give you my takeaways from the game and talk about more football-related stuff rather than non-football related stuff like today's episode, and how that potentially could apply to the Atlanta Falcons. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And, of course, we'll be unpacking more off-season content as the week unfolds. And check out the Everyday Club at the link in the description below, lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. You can join $5 a month or $50 a year. Get a lot of perks, including sweet, sweet merch like this red Locked On Falcons hoodie. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.